Offshore oil and gas is an industry defined by staggering financial scale. The infrastructure required to pull resources costs billions to build and maintain. But that scale eventually ages. Take the Northern Endeavour. This massive floating production vessel spent years operating in the Timor Sea, slowly degrading as the oil fields it serviced depleted. This ledger illustrates a 2015 transaction deciding the vessel's fate. The original operator, Woodside Energy, transferred the aging Northern Endeavour and 2 oil fields to a newly formed, unproven buyer. To cover the eventual cleanup, they set aside exactly 24 million Australian dollars. The disclosures made by the companies were completely accurate. The Australian offshore regulator reviewed the paperwork, followed their standard process, and approved the sale. On paper, it was a textbook, fully compliant corporate exit. 4 years later, the buyer experienced a forced operational shutdown. Unable to absorb the blow, the newly formed company collapsed into bankruptcy. When an offshore operator goes bankrupt, the ocean doesn't take the asset back. Responsibility for maintaining the massive vessel and the liability to eventually dismantle it defaulted straight to the Australian government. This chart shows how severely the initial math failed. The actual cleanup cost bypassed that original $24 million provision and climbed past 1 billion Australian dollars. That's a 40 times miss, triggering complex litigation and forcing an industry-wide levy to cover the damage. Nobody involved in this deal broke any rules. The corporate disclosures were honest, the regulators followed procedure exactly. Yet an approved transaction still produced a catastrophic financial burden for the public. Brig Syed Abid Shah, founder of the Aquarian Systematic Resilience doctrine, spent weeks analyzing the Northern Endeavour transaction. His investigation uncovered a systemic loophole that allows companies to shed massive liabilities through the very process of a legal sale. This comparison highlights the difference between ordinary regulatory failure and this mechanism. On the left is standard underbonding, where regulators passively collect too little money over time. On the right is a singular transaction node. Shah calls this liability laundering, converting a foreseeable future liability into a clean present-day asset sale. The burden is scrubbed from the original seller's books the moment the transfer is approved. The failure occurs because regulators only check the paperwork rather than stress testing the new buyer's actual financial capacity. When the buyer fails, the liability drops directly onto the public. Liability laundering acts as a corporate shield, a legal mechanism for passing foreseeable costs to entities designed to fail. Shah's risk valuation model for the Northern Endeavour transaction assigned the unproven buyer a 35% probability of failure at the point of sale. Applying that probability to the deal reveals a hidden, avoidable exposure of roughly 458 to 946 million Australian dollars, a risk the regulators' process completely failed to capture. Major international energy companies are now using this exact blueprint to divest older fields across the globe. In the Niger Delta, companies like Shell and ExxonMobil are retreating to deepwater assets while selling onshore and shallow water fields to domestic buyers. While the Australian government could absorb a billion-dollar bill, the cost in Nigeria is borne directly by fishing and farming communities. The result is unquantified environmental destruction that these communities have no capacity to remediate. A 2025 United Nations report explicitly linked this wave of corporate divestments to ongoing violations of the right to health and safe water. The dead fish on these blackened shores are the direct consequence of the legal mechanism used to transfer ownership. In wealthy nations, liability laundering is a financial burden. In the developing world, it becomes a direct human rights crisis. This loophole is growing more dangerous as major energy corporations age out of their initial assets and rapidly retreat toward deepwater drilling. Shah is now challenging industry professionals to review his model. For those in project finance or regulation, is a 35% failure probability an accurate reflection of the risk for a thinly capitalized buyer taking on an aging, single-asset vessel? To those with knowledge of remediation economics, is the cost-scaling logic used to bound the Niger Delta exposure, anchored to the UN's Ogunland assessment, defensible? Finally, have you witnessed a third case of this exact pattern? A capable seller, an unproven buyer, and a regulator that approved the deal anyway. The complete calculation and full working paper will be published on August 1st, 2026, as the 24th edition of Aquarian Systematic Resilience on LinkedIn. Until regulators mandate strict stress tests for the financial survival of new buyers, following the rules will remain the most devastating loophole in the energy sector.